Hi, I'm Dr. Elliott Malamet. Really happy to be here this morning with Rabbi Herzl. Certain themes that are related to Pesach, to Passover, specifically constriction and freedom, and not in vague terms, not in abstract sense, but rather the kinds of confinements or restrictions that people feel today in their daily lives, both as human beings and especially as Jews, and the kinds of things that might liberate us in a spiritual sense going forward. So Herzl, both of the term Mitzrayim, which means Egypt, comes from the Hebrew cognate meaning narrow or constricted from the word tsar. And I'm wondering, in your view, what do you see as the kinds of constrictions that people face in their Jewish life today?
Well, I think that we need to distinguish between constrictions upon us as human beings and constrictions upon us as Jews. As human beings, we all suffer constrictions. The nature of being human is suffering constrictions. We can't impose our will on others. The things that we desire can hurt others, so we have to restrict ourselves. Um, so there's all these frustrations that we can experience. So those are, you could say, universal constrictions. Jewish
Yeah.
constrictions, I think, as Jews, I think there's a universal challenge of finding meaning in modern or postmodern times. And I would break up the Jewish population, broadly speaking, into two groups: those who are committed to halakha, to the practice of halakha, and those who are very committed to being Jewish, but do not express that through their commitment, through commitment to halakha. And I think each group finds meaning in what they are committed to. I think the halachically committed find meaning through practice. And what the practice does for them, it unites them socially, and it also connects them to, to a world which has meaning for them, to a feeling of being together with God through the actions that they are performing. That's one group. The second group of Jews who feel very committed to being Jewish, their Jewishness and the meaning they find in their Jewishness is through commitment to other people, to social movements, to what's called tikkun olam. And I think that both these groups stand to learn much from one another. The halachically committed group could use a very strong dose of universality, of care for the world at large, what you could call the prophetic pathos, namely the big ideas about justice and caring for the other. Those are the prophetic ideas. They could use a strong dose of that. Whereas the Jews who see their Jewishness as being expressed through their social commitments, they could use a very strong dose of the Talmudic sages, where the commitment gets expressed in the very detailed actions of life. So we're all challenged to find meaning, and this is just a broad overview. And in every individual, this exists in smaller doses.
I mean, one of the points you're making here is in a way the seeming inability of these two groups to interact, to find a common denominator, to find a discourse where they can speak to one another. I'm wondering why you think it's possible it's always been that way. I can't account for it historically, but it seems particularly bad today. There's a kind of tribalism that's crept into all areas of modern life, not just Jewish life, all areas of modern life. Political discourse is tribal, religious discourse is tribal. Why do you think we've gotten to that point in Jewish life, and what can we do about it?
Well, it's a really hard question. I think that Jews who are committed to tradition feel embattled by both modernity and postmodernity, where modernity is characterized by the ability to make choices, which in traditional society choices were not available. And postmodernism is seen as a threat because it undermines all claims of objective truth, which traditional religion is based upon. So we both have an attack on the fact on traditional society, because we can make choices today to which society to belong. People can even choose what gender they are, which were choices which did not exist before. So that's one threat, and the other threat is just this doesn't seem to be any objective truth out there to which to cling to. So I think those threats create a fear and rigidity, and that makes it difficult to have authentic conversations.
So it's actually a very tricky balance, really, if you think about it, which is that the fear of modernity leads to, I mean, a good example of this, the fear of modernity would actually be the current sort of response to the coronavirus crisis in certain more traditional communities, where the lack of filtration of news plus the general suspicion of modern society, secular society, has led to a good deal more illness than perhaps would have been.
Right.
So that's one problem. The problem is that it actually creates a difficulty. On the other hand, if I'm empathic to their fear, the worry is that if society will erode, people will lose traditional values and connections. So how do you find the balance, I guess is what I'm asking. How do you find the balance between letting those parts of modernity that will be enhancing and lose your foundation?
Well, my first response, I don't have an answer to that. So I'm going to talk about responding to that. And I think that people have to look inside and come to terms with what it is they really believe and to feel secure in that. Once you're there, I think that opens up the ability to talk to people that don't share what you believe. In other words, if I look inside and I say, like, what do I really believe? And based on what do I believe it? So the truth is, it's an emotional commitment that has to do with all sorts of circumstances. It has to do with how I was brought up and the schools I went to and the relationship I have with my parents, all sorts of things that don't have anything directly to do with the things that I assert to be true. And the first thing I have to do is recognize that. And then I can appreciate that in other people, that they believe what they believe, is also a subjective state. And that, I think, is the best we can do as human beings. That's what Peter Berger calls soft certainty. In other words, this is what I believe because this is what I believe, but I cannot impose it upon you. But once I begin with that, I can actually talk to you. And I don't have to feel threatened that you're going to prove that I'm wrong if I consider what you say, or I'm not trying to prove you wrong by what I'm trying to say. The dialogue becomes much more one of sharing rather than trying to convince someone or indoctrinate them.
I think part of the difficulty here is the uncertainty that people feel. You talked about Peter Berger in The Heretical Imperative. He talks about the idea of the world taken for granted, and that you no longer can do that. And those religious societies can no longer take easy dogmas or ideas that were fostered through insularity that once they get exposed to the light, it's harder to feel secure in them. So it's one thing to talk about, one has to know what one believes, but I often find in modern culture that that's not necessarily a permanently rooted thing. It shifts, it responds to the winds of culture, and it's not so simple to say, this is what I believe and I believe it for life. There are fluctuations that occur.
I think the shift has to be not what do I believe, it has to be more in terms of how do I believe.
Can you explain that?
Yeah. When you talk about what you believe, you're talking about dogmas. And in a world which is, pre-modern, we could really believe the dogmas in a very naive way.
Yeah.
but we've eaten from the Eitz Hadat. We've eaten from the tree of knowledge, for good and for good and for evil. It's the tree of knowledge
Right.
of good and evil. So for good and evil, we've eaten from that. So we're not naive anymore. So the question has to move away from what it is I believe, because if I believe this and you believe that, then we can't really talk to each other. But it has to move to how is it that we believe. And this is where I think Berger's idea of soft certainty is extremely valuable. I believe with soft certainty. There's certain ways that I behave, certain ways that I interpret the world because of who I am. And I recognize that you're a different person and you walk the planet in a different way. But since we're both human beings, there's a lot in common with how we interpret things, and that could be the basis of an authentic conversation.
When you think about the Hagadah and its categories of children, I'm especially struck by this in light of what you were just talking about. You know, there's a good deal of labeling that goes on in the Hagadah that I've always found very disturbing. We've both spent many, many years in education. I think it's true to say that for both of us that I've never seen this like wicked child that the Haggadah is talking about. And when I see a child who doesn't ask a question, it's not because they're dumb. It usually means that they've sniffed out an atmosphere that doesn't encourage questioning, and they have reverted to safety. They figured out the question. So I've often been disturbed by that kind of labeling that goes on in the Haggadah. And I wonder how you feel about these children that are being described there.
I never thought of specific children when we talk about the Arba Banim. They're more typologies. So I never took it in the direction that you're suggesting, because there is an idea of someone that is presenting a challenge, but they're not really engaging because they're too involved in themselves and they're not really engaging. They just get interested in getting you out of the way. So that's like the Ben Rasha. It's very interesting. Is the Ben Rasha and the Ben Chacham, the language is the same.
Yeah, it's similar.
So the difference is really the attitude. Here's another example. The difference is the attitude rather than the content. They can both say, what is this about, and challenge you, but it's very interesting. It's very ad hominem, that two people can say the same thing and one is a Chacham and one is a Rasha, because the attitude that they are conveying is very different. Where the Rasha is someone that is not engaging, and he's just saying what he's saying to get you out of his face. So that's how I understand it. It's not that I know anybody that's like that, or that I've ever come across a student that's like that, but as a typology, not engaging is the Ben Rasha, and the Chacham is the one who's challenging, and we need that challenge to be authentically put forward in order to be able to grow. And the son who is the Eino Yodeh Lish'ol, the one who doesn't know how to ask, he's the one in the worst. He's in the worst shape, because he has internalized the Rasha. The Rasha is not engaging from the outside, and he has inside lost his ability to engage, because I think this goes back to what we talked about before. I think he's afraid. I think that there's a lot of repression in the Eino Yodeh Lish'ol. He has internalized the fear that is being transmitted to him from the outside, that you can't engage in modernity or post-modernity. It's too dangerous. So it just shuts up the ability to ask questions. So the question I ask myself is the establishment, quote unquote, the establishment interested in actually producing children she'enam yodim l'sh'ol? And maybe that's easy, to have the children she'enam yodim l'sh'ol, to have they're the good kids.
Right. I actually saw a relation between the one who doesn't ask and the wise son. I see the wise son differently than you. I see the wise son as having learned the language of religion. And so he becomes very seductive to the establishment. You know, in his question, he alludes to all the various kinds of laws, and he's speaking insider speak. Whereas the Rasha is really speaking outsider speak. He's the one who's alienated, possibly, although it isn't inherent in his question that he's actually alienated. It's possible that the insertion of the word avodah, work or burden or labor, makes it sound like he thinks of it all as a drag, but it could be an honest, sincere question. He just wants to know, you know, what's going on. I think that it's very unlikely that there are people who don't not ask questions, right? If you think about a kind of, you are, you know, airdropped into a place where nobody knows your language. You know, you're in the middle of some tribal village somewhere. You still could figure out how to ask a question. You can use certain kinds of universal ways of expressing yourself. You could inquire, is what I'm saying. There's almost no conditions under which inquiry is impossible, unless, as you said, you've been taught to fear inquiry. At that point, it becomes impossible.
Right, so
not because of any inherent lack.
Right, so the real slave, the one who hasn't been liberated from Mitzrayim, is the one she'eino yodeh l'sh'ol. The Rav talks about the existential silence of the slave. And he talks about the emergence of the power of speech in the process of redemption, where first Bnei Israel, vaye'anchu min ha'avodah, they sigh, and the sigh gradually takes on a verbal form, and it moves to prayer, because the slave is existentially silent. That's the way the Rav put it. So in a sense, I'm thinking now, the she'eino yodeh l'sh'ol is the one who remained silent, and he interiorized the master's point of view. The master has been interiorized in the form of repression, that he doesn't even, it's not that he has questions and he's afraid to ask them. That would already be good, right? But he doesn't even sense the questions. It's this negative type of naivete.
You're talking about Rabbi Soloveitchik's discussion of speech. If you think about the four children in sequence, you're actually going from the most verbose to the least. You start out with this flurry. The wicked son's question is much more, it's curt, it's like 4 words. The Tam, even shorter, till silence, right? You actually have a progression from wise to inarticulate, and they say less and less and less, and you end up with silence.
Right. So I think like ilu haya sham lo haya nigal, which we say to the Russia, if you were there,
you wouldn't have been redeemed.
Taken out because you weren't part of us. I think that applies to the she'eino yodeh l'sh'ol as well.
Right, but that's an exclusionary maneuver that be. You know, that's something to say. If you don't speak the right speak, you're on the outside. We're not taking you in. I see that discourse.
I don't think it's a question of not speaking the right speak. I think that we all, when somebody that doesn't speak the right speak to us, when they speak to us, I personally, and I know you're like this, and I think most people who are committed to traditional like this will try to explain it to them in their terms, because we sort of dance in both worlds. We speak the speak, but we know the other language also. So we're always trying to translate one language into the other, and that's challenging, but we try to do that. So if we feel that if a person is coming to us sincerely, but they're asking these questions, which the language that they're using and the way that they're thinking about it needs to be shifted. We feel it needs to be shifted so that we can translate it for them and for ourselves. That's okay. But I think the model of here I'm very frum in a sense. I'll accept Chazal's interpretation of the Ben Rasha. Right? Chazal interpret the Ben Rasha as not really asking a question in order to get an answer or in order to understand. So it's not a question that he speaks a different language and he wants to understand, but we can't deal with it. I think that could even be the fate of the Chacham, right? Where we people have problem dealing with the Chacham who's asking real questions. But the Rasha, I'll accept Chazal. My intuition is to accept what Chazal's interpretation of what they wanted to tell us about the Ben Rasha, which is that he's not really asking. There's an ad hominem argument here. It's very Nietzschean that two people can say the same thing and one person is a Russia and the other person is not. Because
what's Nietzschean about it is basically the, if you will, the will to power of the rabbis. Because if you go back to the original text on which it's based, which is in Parshat Bo, in I think it's Parakut Beit, chapter 12, verses 26 and 7. There's no condemnation coming from the Torah. That child says to you, "What is this service to you?" and gets a very kind of calm, informed response. There's none of that histrionic drama with, oh, smack his teeth and exclude him, and you wouldn't have gone out of Egypt, and what kind of question is that? None of that seems to pertain in the original text. So it's a very odd maneuver that they made. They took this very kind of calm exchange in the Torah and turned it into one where this child is clearly not interested and negative and hostile, and right? So that's a maneuver that the rabbis make, and I think it's a maneuver to create certain kinds of definitive categories to say this is in and this is out. In fact, I think it's the kind of disease that we have now, where we look at Jews and we say, oh, you said that? That must mean you're a this.
Well, I think that there is a disease of labeling. It's not only, I don't think it's restricted to Jewish society. I think you just have to look at Facebook for 5 minutes and people are labeling. It's painful, right? They did a study that Facebook causes people to get depressed. And when I look at it, it gets me depressed because people are constantly labeling other people in order not to talk to them. So I don't deny, Elliott, that you can and people do take the story of the Arba Banim and they can interpret it that way. In the sense that when I say that I'm from, I don't think that Chazal meant it that way. I think Chazal had a lot of self-confidence, and I don't think that they necessarily, right? Chazal isn't one person, but I don't think the Baal Hagadah felt the need to exclude people. I think that these 4 sons are typologies, and that there is a phenomena of someone who is so far removed that they're not engaging and they're hostile. So the question is, how do you deal with hostility? Right? What I think we shouldn't do is say anybody that doesn't agree with us, we automatically project our hostility towards them and say they're hostile towards us, right? That's certainly something we have to be aware of. But there is real hostility, and the question is how you confront that.
If the hostility, I think, is so toxic and so acerbic that it's scary, it's hard to engage with it. But I would say a certain kind of modern thing. When I think of my time in the classroom when I taught high school, the worst situation was really not hostility. It was total apathetic indifference. Like, the student's just elsewhere, which I actually relate to. But if you had somebody who was upset about something that you were teaching or something in the text, that usually portended very well.
Right.
Because it meant that they were engaged, that something had emotionally triggered them, irked them, provoked them. And there was certainly a conversation that could ensue from that. So I don't necessarily see hostility, as long as it's not toxic, as a bad thing.
Okay. So the question is, what were Chazal talking about? Like that would be a point for actually for some sort of historical investigation of what was going on at the time, right. And if they were feeling challenged, just like we're challenged by modernity and postmodernity, if they might have been challenged by early Christianity, by what they perceived to be heretical movements, by Greek philosophy, what was going on, I don't know. But I'm saying that for us, I certainly would would not want to learn the lesson of the Ben Rasha as saying that people who speak a different language than us, a different religious language than us, or a different existential language than us, that we should exclude them and say, you don't speak the language, so you're out. I think that is going back to your original question. If you talk about what plagues we suffer from, there's this natural tendency to exclude people who are not like us, which, by the way, is also very much expressed these days with the epidemic, right? Because it's always the other people that are responsible. It's the Chinese virus. It's not in the Middle Ages, it was the Jewish, it was the Jewish plague. So it's the Chinese virus. It's, the people that are dying are not like us, right? Because we're both, even happy birthday, just turned 60, right? And I'm 62. So we're on the borderline of what's called here in Israel as the Kfutzat Sikun, as the threatened population. But I don't feel threatened. Baruch Hashem, I'm healthy. And so, but we naturally think, okay, every time they report a death, they'll always report the age of the person, and they'll invariably tell us that the person had some pre-existing medical condition. Right? So why that? Why report that and not say the person had this many children, or the person, whatever, right? Something else about them. Because what people want to hear is that that's not me. Right? Right. And that's where using magical methods, they wouldn't call it magic, but the insistence on continuing to daven in a minyan, the insistence of we're going to continue learning in yeshiva, which they have since stopped, I think, right? But minyanim haven't stopped. This idea that magically we'll be protected, right? So that we'll be different. We perceive ourselves.
There's a kind of a fusion here. There is a kind of magical thinking that's associated with religion, but there's also existential truth about what Irvin Yalom calls the myth of our own uniqueness. You see this in the Tolstoy story, the death of Ivan Ilyich, where he doesn't believe he can die. And he says explicitly, this is what happens to other people.
Right.
So you see that today. You see people feeling like, yeah, I know that there's people dying all around me and stuff's happening, but like I'm somehow in this immune zone where, stuff's not going to happen to me. Not just in the current virus situation, but in general, it's not going to happen to me. So the myth of our own uniqueness, that we can do things and somehow we won't suffer the same repercussions as other people. I wanted to ask you, we've been talking about models of conversation about, there is a model of conversation in the Hagadah, which is the 5 rabbis in Bnei Brak staying up all night and seemingly roused out of their conversation by their students in the morning, telling them, it's daybreak and, it's come time to say the Shema. Do you see that deal model? What do you see as the value of that conversation?
The truth is, I always loved that story. In the conversations that we've had beforehand, you like the story less, but I always loved the story. I always felt that at the Seder at home with my family growing up, I always felt we were like reenacting that story, and I always felt that those Tanaim were with us around the table. When I'm thinking about that story now, I think that there are 2 different aspects of reality which are being reflected in that story. There's the consciousness that those rabbis have, and there's the students who intrude by saying Higi Azman Kriyat Shema Shacharit, that it's morning. And I think one aspect of reality, and the reality that the rabbis are experiencing, is something they've sort of descended into the world of myth, into an experience where time has evaporated, and they're just there, right? Yetziat Mitzrayim was I don't know, 1,000 years earlier, whatever, right? It was 1,000 years earlier, but they weren't living it as a historical event. They were there. And that's really the mitzvah of Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, is somehow to transport yourself back there. So they're there, and time, present time, has evaporated for them. And the students come with a halacha that it's Zman Kriyat Shema, it's time for something. And that brings them back into the world. Right? So there's this, it actually runs parallel, you can say, to the two groups of Jews that we were talking about before, like the ones with the big ideas and the ones that are in the world with their praxis, with their specific actions. So you have the rabbis, Leil HaSeder, they're like connecting to this primary religious experience above time, and that's like that's like your own your perception of yourself disconnected from the world, right? Just you, deep inside, right?
Yeah.
And then there's the outside world, has a way, very annoying way of asserting itself, right? Like, don't bother me. No, but I have to bother you. The world comes in. And these are the two aspects of what it is to be human, right? To have the interior reality, which is not touched by time. And that's where the rabbis are reveling. Right? And then the outside world comes in with history, and you have to do something, and etc.
No, I agree with you. I wouldn't say I don't like that story. I like the story. I like the idea of the ability to lose yourself and intensively discuss, and the sort of the we're really having a kind of Platonic symposium, like all night. And we're talking about things of substance. I love that part. What I wasn't crazy about was the optics. In other words, you got your 5 rabbis in the basement, you know, like, where's everybody else? Where are the women? Where's the family? Like, what's going?
Yeah, I don't think that's fair. You're being a little anachronistic in that type of.
No, I understand that being anachronistic,
yeah.
but all interpretation is anachronistic. You know, I view everything as a modern. So for me as a modern, it doesn't resonate quite the way it might at one time. But I like the notion of that intensiveness, and the fact that, as I said, that they're spending time, and they're talking about stuff that they really feel is of something you said before, which is this central, really, mitzvah of the evening, which is to see yourself coming out of Egypt. In some ways, I've always found that extraordinarily hard, right? Because the root fact is although tragically there are millions and millions of people who actually are slaves today, current estimates is something like 40 million people in one form or another. I'm not one of them, and you're not one of them, and most you have to metaphorize, right? You have to do some. I mean, Maimonides talks about this when he codifies the law, and makes a little change and says, well, you have to demonstrate to yourself that now you're coming out of Egypt.
Right.
How do you think we can do that?
That's a really hard one, because you're asking a really hard question, and there's like, I feel like there's like a knee-jerk reaction to give the simple answer, right? Where concentration.
Well, do you feel it has something to do with focusing on where their life?
What's that?
And how that kind of liberation. Do you feel that something about it has to do with where an individual might feel stuck in their life, and somehow how they can liberate themselves even in incremental ways?
I think incremental is a very important part of it. One way to take it, one direction to take it, is to take it into questions like, where am I, to what am I enslaved to? Am I enslaved to my work? Am I enslaved to some sort of addiction? Am I enslaved to, I don't know, a desire to succeed? All sorts of things that, to be well known, to have, 1,000 likes on this video that we're producing, right? Like, so what are, I think incremental is key here, because to solve the world's suffering, even to try to feel the suffering of the world, is could be too much. It would be too much. So I think that by trying to focus on pieces of the world, or even pieces of the suffering, could be a way forward.
Okay.
Okay.
I think on that note, I wish everybody a Chag Sameach. It was great being with you today.
Thank
And
you.
be well.
Thank you. And happy birthday again.